This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Dr. Leslie Torres-Rodriguez grew up in Hartford after moving to the capital city from Puerto Rico with her family as a young girl. She graduated from Hartford Public School, and years later, she's the school district's newest leader. Today, Where We Live, Superintendent Torres-Rodriguez is in studio with us to answer our questions and yours. Hartford is poised to receive additional educational aid from the state under Malloy's plan if the legislature doesn't adopt its own budget by October. The money comes at a time when the capital city is weighing whether to file for bankruptcy. Given this financial uncertainty, how will Hartford Public Schools use their resources to strengthen and improve student achievement? Now, are you a city resident? Are you a parent of a Hartford school student? What questions do you have for Dr. Torres-Rodriguez? You can join the conversation this hour, 860-275-7266. Email wherewelive@wnpr.org. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter @wherewelive. I want to welcome Dr. Leslie Torres-Rodriguez back to the show. Thanks for coming in today.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Before we get into learning a little bit about your personal life and what led you to become the new superintendent, I wanted to just reflect on some news that's happening in our country. It's expected that President Trump will announce what's going to happen to the DACA program, which is deferred action for students who are undocumented in this country. There are reports that he will rescind that program. I'm curious, as the leader of the Hartford Public Schools, how your team has been responsive to the undocumented families that live in the capital city.
You know, from the beginning, my administration and my team has been very clear with our families that we essentially do not need to know where our students are coming from in terms of their status. We welcome every one of our students and their families, and so we've been very upfront since the beginning about that.
Have there been fears, though, because of the national political climate? What are your office, what are they hearing? What are teachers hearing from their students?
We did initially have more of our high schoolers, our secondary students, question their safety. A few of the lower grade students did express to their teachers, whether or not they should come to school, in the next day, if you will, because they weren't sure what was going to happen to their families and to their parents. And so those were very unique cases that we heard about. But in general, our older students were most cautious and aware of their uncertainty.
How do you feel personally when you see that fear among these families?
So it's personal, right? It gets very personal for me as a migrant myself. The experience of just being in a new setting, in a new culture, it's just so challenging to navigate. And then you add the fact that you may not be welcomed in the nation that you and your family sought to for refuge to improve your future. Imagine trying to navigate that as a young child or a young adult, and trying to work through that while having to navigate a new language, while having to navigate the psychosocial adolescent experience. That's a lot for our children to struggle through and with. And so for me personally, I can identify, and so making sure that we create the conditions to support all of our students and the whole child, if you will.
School started in Hartford this week. Have you been talking with teachers about what to say to some of these students if the concern again comes up?
Yes, we're actually sending today a resource packet for all of our administrators and all of our students. But the message to our staff, which was a message that I wanted to make sure I came across during our convocation on Monday, was one around uncertainty, and to acknowledge the fact that, yes, there is uncertainty, and while we don't want to minimize it, to make sure that we not only verbalize to our students, but with our actions communicate that we are here, showing up every single day for them, and that they're safe, and that if there is a need to unpack, discuss, and process fears, as related to their local context or the national context, that's the space that we have to create in our schools.
You were appointed as the new superintendent in April after serving as acting or interim superintendent for a number of months. Tell us a little bit about your background. You mentioned that you know where some of these students are coming from. You moved here with your family from Puerto Rico when you were a young girl. Tell us about your life.
Yes, so 9 years old. My mother and my brother, we moved smack in the middle of Park Street, one-bedroom, cramped apartment, and I recall going to Burns Elementary School as a fifth grader and having to navigate the new setting. And my first teacher happened to be a Latina woman. And I was so, beside being impressed, right? I felt so safe. Just knowing, right, that there was someone there that I could at some level connect with. Early on I knew that I wanted to become a teacher. And I always say, had it not been for her, right, who knows? I had to learn the language. I struggled. I always speak as to my respect, if you will, for literacy, given the fact that I couldn't access books initially. I did not have books, and it was hard for me to read initially. And so making sure that that I leveraged the resources, and my mother leveraged the community resources around me, the library, if you will, and other community-based organizations, worked my way through the public school system, and struggled at times and was disengaged, quite frankly, up until I got to high school, where I encountered several adults that just saw something in me and embraced me, and then I think it was by the 10th grade that I thought, I think I might want to do this college thing. Not sure what it was. My mother didn't know how to navigate any of it, right? And so had to work myself through college, and I knew that I wanted to become an educator early on, just didn't know how to get there. And I recall the finances were always an issue for us. And so I was going to school, and my hope was to become a teacher. That was my dream. But then I met some professors from UConn School of Social Work midway, second year in college, and they were saying, we've heard you're active in your community. We have this program, a graduate program in social work that, offers scholarships to Latinos, particularly Puerto Ricans in Hartford. And if you ever want to, pursue a graduate degree, do know that we'd love to have you. And that's, my path took a turn there because I wanted the free education, right? And so social work it was. And I ended up as a school social worker for eight years, always knowing that, at my heart, education and teaching was where I wanted to go. And so I taught for 7 years at the community college in Hartford as well. And then always knew that leadership and systemic change was where I wanted to make the impact, and in a community that was very dear to my heart. So I always knew Hartford was a place that I was going to come back to.
It's a big job, and there's lots of challenges. What would you say are the top challenges that you want to address in your first year as the new superintendent?
First year, making sure that the structures exist for success. And, when we think about leaders in organizations, our role is to create the conditions for the change. And as it relates to education, is making sure that we create conditions which can entail removing barriers to access for our students. And so from an operational perspective, which is something that I believe Hartford Public Schools has not tended to in several years, is making sure that we have the structures, protocols, and procedures in place at all levels of the organization. And then, of course, making sure that we build capacity in those that are going to impact the magic that has to happen for our students, which is high-quality teaching and learning. And so that means building capacity in our teachers and in our leaders, while, of course, making sure that we have learning-focused partnerships with our parents and our communities. And so I know that's a lot for year one, to your question, but just making sure that those conditions, those foundational conditions exist in order to have systemic, sustainable change later on.
This is Where We Live. In studio with me today, Dr. Leslie Torres-Rodriguez. She's the newest superintendent in the Hartford Public School system. If you are a resident of the city of Hartford, if your child is a student within the public school system, you can ask the question of the superintendent, 860-275-7266. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is, again, the first week of a new school year, Dr. Torres-Rodriguez. Tell us about who your teachers are. There is the notion that many of the teachers are new teachers, and I'm curious about turnover that has been an issue in years past and how you're addressing that.
And so we have over 3,000 staff members, and the average tenure is 10 years. And so while, we do hear about the turnover, our areas of our challenging areas, if you will, are our shortage areas, which not only at the state but nationally, our math, our science, speech and language therapists, it's a national shortage area. And we have 25 of our certified staff are of color. And so that's something that we're proud of. Of course, there's significant opportunity for improvement there. But we do struggle with regard to those shortage areas, particularly at the middle school level. It's a challenging time for students, right, the middle school. And so I have colleagues that are passionate. They are middle school devotees, and they'll say that it takes a special person to be in middle school. And so we reflect often as to how we attract and retain middle school teachers, particularly in those shortage areas.
How do you help them, especially if they're a new graduate of education school or first or second year out, trying to be a teacher that they've always wanted to be, but they have so many challenges in front of them? How do you help them? I've heard in the past the school district has had coaches for principals, for leaders, but what about the teachers doing the work each and every day?
We do have those supports, but even before that, right, we want to make sure that during our onboarding process that we provide them with all of the technical supports, if you will. And then, of course, it's the human capital piece of it, right, the professional development supports for our teachers. And while, yes, they're going to have their coaches in their schools, we also have central office, district-level supports for our students. Our new teachers have their cohorts that they can participate in and not only feel supported from a collegial perspective, but also in terms of their content area support. And then, of course, making sure that those structures that I talked about at the beginning at the school level exist. We know the research tells us that adults learn best when they do so in collaborative ways, that adults learn best when it is applicable to their own context. And so making sure that at the building level, our new teachers are supported by their colleagues and by their administrators as well.
I started the show mentioning the fiscal problems that not only the city of Hartford's facing, but the whole state of Connecticut. How do those fiscal problems impact these resources you're able to allocate to the teachers, the principals, and other staff?
We were very mindful during the budget process to limit the amount of reductions at the school level. Unfortunately, we weren't able to close a $24 million gap without reducing staff. It was just a challenge that we were faced with. But we wanted to make sure that those instructional coaches remained at the building level. We certainly had about 50 positions throughout the district that were reduced, and over about 30 at the central office level. But those supports were important to us, given that one of our foundational priorities is to develop leaders to lead for learning. And leaders for us, the Hartford Public Schools, does not only encompass a central office leader or a building principal. We believe that our teachers are leaders as well. And so staying true to that foundational commitment meant that we had to make sure that our resources were still there, available to carry out on our commitment.
When you look at resources, what about organization throughout the school district in terms of leadership? I know that you used to once be an assistant superintendent. Can you give us an idea of the structure, and have there been changes so that you're not a top-heavy school district?
We did. I did have a realignment at central office, and we do not have assistant superintendents anymore. We do have chiefs, and there was a parallel process, if you will, in my thought process when the realignment took place. And we had a chief of school improvement. We have chief, academic officer. And given that I wanted to make sure that our structures were as efficient as possible, what I did was have now a chief of elementary and middle grades and then a chief of secondary programming. And so that allowed for streamlining of supports and leadership. And so the assistant superintendent role is no longer necessary. We do have executive directors that support the chiefs, but not only was that an efficiency move, if you will, but it was also programmatically aligned with where it is that we want to take our district. We are in the process of a master planning, a restructuring of our district, and that is a multi-pronged lens, if you will, multiple lenses to that process, not just about the financial piece, but it's also programmatically. And so that realignment at central office, which resulted in some reductions in staff, also was a foundational step, if you will, toward the master planning process.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. You're hearing from Dr. Leslie Torres-Rodriguez, Superintendent of Hartford Public Schools, appointed in April after serving as interim superintendent. We're going to continue to ask her about her vision for the school district and talk about some of the more specific challenges to the school district, including integration and student achievement. Now, what questions do you have for her? Join the conversation, 860-275-7266. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Over the last decade, there have been 4 different school superintendents in Hartford. Dr. Leslie Torres-Rodriguez, a Hartford native herself, is the newest leader of the city school district with more than 20,000 students. She's in studio with us today to answer our questions and yours. Join the conversation, 860-275-7266. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Dr. Torres-Rodriguez, again, school started just on Tuesday. How do you feel supported? Do you believe people are cheering you on?
I do. I do. I know that the community is watching, particularly given the revamping of the process around the consolidation and the restructuring of our district. And so while they express support, they're watching. And so I'm mindful of that. And then, with regard to my colleagues, many colleagues are aware of the challenging context of an urban setting. And so I feel supported, at the very least, by the acknowledgement that it is a challenging context.
You mentioned the challenging context of an urban setting. Tell us what you mean by that.
So from the perspective of who it is that we serve, right, we know, the research tells us that 70% of our students experience adverse childhood experiences, right? And so they show up to our door with oftentimes an inability to access learning. And so that is something that we have to be mindful of. And then the concentration of need that we have to address and program for as well, which, has implications. There are fiscal implications for that as well. And so making sure that we program for all of those needs. And then from a systemic perspective, the challenge of the variance, the significant amount of variance that exists in regard to achievement levels, with regard to equity in terms of access to resources. That's also a challenge. And so many of those that I've referenced are universal to urban context. However, in Hartford adds several other dynamics. The fact that we have the chef implications, right? Unintended as it may be, there are implications that are happening. We have our enrollment challenges in Hartford. We have facilities that are and have been in dire need of attention, and we just don't have the resources to do that, and may not for quite some time. And so all of those, 9 years of flat funding compound all of that, and so that's that's a very unique challenge to Hartford.
Let's break that down a little bit. The implications of Chef versus O'Neill. You mentioned some of the resources, the physical buildings that have been neglected throughout some of investigative reporting that the Hartford Current did just a couple of months ago about the legacy of Chef versus O'Neill. This idea that there are still children languishing in neighborhood schools because of not being able to get a seat in one of these magnet schools that the state has poured in billions of dollars to have the system to try to reach integration, but that's not quite happening. Can you talk a little bit about how these neighborhood schools, how you can redirect the resources to help these kids get a quality education too?
That is very real. I actually just got communicated with a parent who was so frustrated that over the years has not been able to access seats. And so, and while, there are neighborhood schools, some of our neighborhood schools face, many of the challenges that I described. And so one of the goals through the restructuring process is to divert resources to our neighborhood schools and make sure that all of our schools in Hartford are high-quality schools. But as you know, change takes time, and systemic change also takes time. And so we can say that we are going to have more resources for our schools, but it's not just about the resources, right? We have to invest at many levels. We have to invest again in the human capital. We have to invest in the community resources that must exist in order to support the whole child. And so it's a multi-pronged approach, but the reality is that there are empty seats. Bottom line, empty seats that students cannot access.
You mentioned restructuring. So I think last year, a lot of schools were getting consolidated. Staff was being decreased. How are you moving forward with further consolidation in this new year?
So last year we were, there was one school that the Capital Community Magnet Academy is now at Capital Prep. And the process moving forward is, I want to make sure that our community understands that this process is not just about facilities. This process is not just about enrollment, right? We are looking at this from so many different angles. Ultimately, what we want to create is a system in which all of our students have the access, right, to high-quality programming, but also programming that makes sense for our families. We have 13 different grade configuration levels in Hartford. And so making sure that we have intentional pathways for our families, making sure that our families have access to neighborhood schools that are high quality as well. And so we want to make sure that our community is part of this process. And so we can identify if today you said to me, Dr. Torres-Rodriguez, which schools should be closed because of facilities. Well, that's easy to determine, right? Because we know the facilities that are in dire need of repair. If you were to ask me from a one-dimensional perspective, what facilities due to low enrollment should close, we can identify. The data tells us that, but we cannot look at it, so narrowly. It's a multi-pronged dilemma that needs to be addressed. And so making sure that the community understands that, and then having parents, particularly our parents and our students at the table, letting us know what is it that you believe makes a high-quality school. And we've asked those conversations, Lucy, and what we hear from parents, the number one thing that continues to come up for our parents is high achievement. They want a school in which their child is going to achieve at high levels. Number two, what parents are telling us is that to make sure that the community resources are in place, that if their school happens to be closed and or consolidated, that the community resources will remain wherever it is that they and or their child happen to go.
I wanted to get some listener phone calls in our conversation. You can join the conversation, ask a question of the new superintendent of Hartford Public. That's Dr. Leslie Torres-Rodriguez. The number 860-275-7266. Diane's calling from Hartford. Diane, you're on the show.
Good morning. I just wanted to say thank you to Dr. Torres-Rodriguez. It's such a pleasure to hear somebody who's really invested in the school. And quite frankly, if you're just able to achieve half of what you set out in the next year or two, Hartford will be well served. I just had two quick questions for you. I'm a North Ender, and so I wanted to know about the progress on the Weaver High School construction. And then there was a proposal for the Martin Luther King elementary school that was floated through earlier this year, and I wanted to know what kind of progress or status that had.
So Weaver continues. We are going to move forward with Weaver, including the phase 3 of the Weaver project, which is the field house. So that's good news. And I just want to kind of backtrack, Diane, and with regard to the conversation that I was just having with Lucy around making sure that there are pathways. That I want to make sure that that also remains at the center of the conversation, not only with regard to the construction, yes, that matters, but that there's a programmatic piece that happens parallel to that as well, so that we're now being able, to plan ahead for our students, so that when Weaver opens in in a couple of years, we'll be able to fill those seats. And with regard to MLK, which, by the way, Diane, is part of the larger picture for Weaver as well. MLK is slated to be a dual campus. MLK is going to be a middle school, 6 through 8, and also half of the facility, if you will be a magnet school. But that's moving forward. I know that the community has raised questions with regard to the finances, and the uncertainty with the state budget. And so we are waiting to see if there's any additional news. But as we know it, we are scheduled to have both construction projects move forward.
When we talk about just the fiscal challenges, again, Governor Malloy, under his plan, if there's no budget from the state legislature by October, Alliance school districts, including Hartford, will be getting additional educational aid than what they've received in the past. Other school districts that are considered wealthier, like neighboring West Hartford, will be getting huge cuts. Can you talk through with us exactly how those resources will be used, considering also that the city's weighing whether to file bankruptcy? And I mean, is it really going to be excess dollars to fulfill the needs of getting certain resources to neighborhood schools, or it's going to be flat funded when it's all said and done?
So, with regard to the Alliance, our Alliance grant, we did receive communication that it was going to remain the same, the Alliance grant. The worry and the uncertainty for us is with regard to a priority school district grant. And so $5.5 million last year for us. And so that's a wondering that we have, given that it's all staff. Most of it is staffing, from our pre-K teachers to the instructional coach, some instructional coaches that we referenced before. And I want to also, I know you talked about, for example, neighboring West Hartford, and I know, and I want to validate the fact that and acknowledge that, all students, all districts, have their need. And so while I want to validate that, I have to bring it home, to Hartford and say that any reductions, obviously, given the fact that we had to mitigate $24 million already, will have significant impact. And we are being responsive. I want to just, in case anyone, kind of questions, close the schools, because I've heard that as well, And I want to be transparent about that. When you close a school, you have to be mindful of the impact on families, obviously, but impact on the community, which we hear often. We hear when I go in the community and have these conversations, the question is, what is going to happen to the empty building? And knowing that an empty building, a blighted space, does nothing for a community. And so being mindful of that as well throughout the process.
The Current reported that you are technically the highest paid city employee, with your salary of $260,000 in the first year of your 3-year contract. How do you answer to that salary when you are hearing about the challenges within your own school district? And you just said yourself, having to make more cuts in the future that'll fall on staff.
That's always, a tough one. I can think about it from a very technical perspective, the city will not mitigate their gap with a superintendent's salary, right? That's one way to look at it. But, when I look at the challenge and the complexity of the job, the residents of Hartford will get more than 100% in their investment in my salary. I am given more than the 100%. It is a 24/7 job that I am committed to the importance of it, from education to developing communities to developing capacity in the future of Hartford. And so it's broader than the number. And while, right, given the context, it's hard for that to be separated, that's how I look at it. That the taxpayers will get 100% and more of the investment. I am committed for the long haul to making sure that we transform our district.
I mentioned earlier that you're the fourth superintendent in the last decade. What is morale in terms of the people, again, that are in the classrooms, that are leading some of these struggling schools? Do you feel like they have confidence in your leadership?
I have had, conversations. Granted, we do have over 3,000 employees. I've not spoken directly to all of them, but I did get some feedback with regard to focus and how important that is, and that we're narrowing our focus on making sure that we operate well, that we are focused on student outcomes, and that's a change. Whether or not all 3,000 of them have confidence in me, nonetheless, I'm here. I'm here to make sure that I create those conditions and that I communicate in a way that not only verbally communicates, but through my actions speaks to creating those conditions that I spoke about, so that our teachers feel supported in terms of their professional capacity to do the work for our students.
You're listening to Where We Live with Dr. Leslie Torres-Rodriguez. She's Hartford Public School's newest superintendent. Join the conversation, 860-275-7266. What challenge do you see at your child's school? If you're a city taxpayer, do you think the Hartford Public Schools are doing a good job with the limited resources they have? Again, 860-275-7266. Eric's calling from New Haven. Eric, you're on the show.
Hi. Thank you for having me on. My question is around diversity with leadership in schools as well as teachers. What barriers, from your perspective, exist to getting more diversity up in the leadership ranks of the schools, and what can be done to alleviate some of those barriers? And I'll take my answer offline.
Thanks, Eric. Go ahead. He wanted to ask you about what you're doing to help with the diversity within the ranks.
So we want to make sure that internally, if we will, we build our capacity. For the teachers that we currently have, right, we want to make sure that we have a pipeline of leaders, and then making sure that we are trying to actively recruit leaders of color that represent and that culturally who it is that we serve. It's a struggle it's a conversation that I have with other superintendents and other counterparts around how challenging it is. And then, of course, we have, as educators, we think, okay, so what's the root cause here? How can we identify what the initial dilemma is? And I always go back to the experiences that our students are having in the classrooms, right? To wondering that I have. Is it that our students are having, could it be that our students are having an experience in which they're, not interested in becoming educators? And then I have to think about how do we entice our students to become educators, right? When we hear a student speaking, not often do I hear, I want to be a teacher. And so that's something that we have to think about from a systemic perspective as well. But to your point, Eric, it's something that we struggle with, but we want to make sure that we celebrate the fact that 25% of our certified teaching force is are of color, and so we remain committed to making sure that we continue to increase that number.
Let's talk about student achievement. The SBAC preliminary results came out in Hartford. The percentage of students reaching the state standard in English actually dropped from last year, from 25.8% to 22%. In math, the percentage dropped from 16% to 15.5% this year. Why are these numbers so abysmal?
Yeah, so that's, to my comment earlier around the variance, we have pockets of excellence in Hartford, but it's not systematized. And so one of our strategies, and this is a focus area that remains, is, the early literacy work. And so this year, another focus is to make sure that we have a solid, what is called a Tier 1 instruction foundation. And so Tier 1 is the teaching and learning, if you will, that happens and that about 80% of our students can access, right? So regular education instruction. And so making sure that that Tier 1 instruction is aligned, obviously, to standards and that is rigorous, but in a way that our students, all of our students, can access, right? Making sure that we're mindful of the fact that about 18% of our students are special education students. About another 19 are English learners. And so building, again, capacity in our staff around the literacy so that it can be embedded in through all of our subject areas.
I wanted to take another call from a listener, and you can join the conversation, 860-275-7266. Again, the newest Hartford School Superintendent, Dr. Leslie Torres-Rodriguez, is in studio with us. Mary's calling from Hartford. Mary, you're on the show.
Hi. So given what's happening in Houston, we're recognizing that this next generation is going to have unprecedented challenges with climate change. And a lot of the school buildings are located along the riparian corridors or within floodplains, and they use energy, and schools are places where everybody ought to be learning teamwork. How are you, as the leader of the Hartford school system, helping give direction to your schools to help train the next generation to deal with climate change and to become more aware of their surroundings and how to manage them in a way that will be sustainable?
I actually want to acknowledge and I'm grateful for your question, given that this year I've been working with my leadership team around the development of a whole student framework. And you speak about awareness, and we have several assumptions as part of that framework. That social emotional learning, if you will, serves as a foundation for some very important elements, right? The executive function, the decision making, the self-awareness that is required in order for our students to self-regulate. Again, being mindful of the fact that 70% of our students experience trauma. And while this is not only in particular to the climate change, Mary, that you're questioning about, it is about creating spaces and opportunities for our students to be aware of who they are and their environment. And so with that, we have to build a capacity in our educators to be able to address the whole child, right? To teach our children how to have the self-confidence, the self-concept, the self-esteem to improve their social functioning in their environment. And so it's a framework that we're now developing, but it also ties into our efforts to have restorative approaches to our work as well. So there's a whole behavioral system piece to that framework as well, Mary. But it's culture change. What you're speaking speaks to me about culture change and making sure that we create a culture and a system in which everyone feels that they're part of a larger whole, that everyone feels that they have to honor and validate each other and the environment.
We hear often from officials in the higher education system, and you said that you have taught in the community college system years ago, that graduates, not just in Hartford, but in other school districts around the state, they're not prepared for college. What's the graduation rate of Hartford Public Schools today, and are they adequately prepared?
So we still are waiting for our final graduation rates. Last year's graduation rate was 78, our four-year cohort graduation, so students that graduate within the 4 years. One of the things that I immediately comes to mind when you talk about what is a college ready, what are those standards? And, our last caller talked about the notion of collaborating and that's one of the elements, making sure that our students know how to think critically, how to communicate in multiple ways, how to problem solve. But what I hear often when we speak to our business partners is around the ability to address collaboratively complex problems. And so while there is the academic foundation that has to be that we have to tend to, there are all these other 21st century skills, if you will, college-ready skills that we also have to tend to.
And before we head to break, how is the school district tending to those?
Well, we want to make sure that we allow opportunities for all of our students to not only in the classroom experience the rigor, but to make sure that there's a project-based, mastery-based opportunity where students may not master the skill the first time around, but that through a project-based approach, if you will, that they have an opportunity to show mastery. And then making sure that our students also have connections to internships, project-based learning, so that they're able to make those connections to the real world.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today, we're talking with Hartford Public School Superintendent, Dr. Leslie Torres-Rodriguez. We'll take more of your questions after the break, 860-275-7266. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today we're talking about education, specifically the vision of the new superintendent of Hartford Public Schools, Dr. Leslie Torres-Rodriguez. You can join the conversation, 860-275-7266. Dr. Torres-Rodriguez, we touched on this a little bit earlier about consolidation. As you begin this school year again, what do you say to parents who may see their neighborhood school close? Do you know yet how many schools you'll be closing this year?
We do not know yet how many schools we will be closing and when, nor do we know when we will be closing. One of the things that I've communicated to the Board of Education is what I call a very aggressive timeline. My goal is to, by December, present to the board models of the restructuring, but also process models, because process is going to matter here, given that, it's not going to be one school and it's not going to be two schools, because, we know that the average, I think 85% is what our buildings are used in terms of capacity, what it is that we're using them right now. And so think about that, right? So we have to keep that in mind. But making sure that in the next 3 months, that we have an inclusive process, and we want to hear from our community, from our parents, from our partners as to what it is that they believe makes a high-functioning school. So we know what the research tells us, but we want to be able to couple that with what the contextual need is for our respective communities and in the city. And so, again, the board ultimately decides. By the way, I don't have the power as superintendent to do that. But my recommendation, my job is to make the recommendations based on this informed collaborative process. And so that will happen November and December. And so, there's policy and regulations that certainly I will make sure that the process, is in alignment with. But I want to make sure that I reiterate the fact that it is going to be a challenging, painful process for all of us, and decisions will have to be made. But ultimately, when all is said and done, making sure that what is standing, if you will, for lack of a better way to say it, the programs that remain are going to be programs that are going to meet the needs of all of our students. And that is at the core of what's driving that. It is not to save money. It is to reinvest resources.
Can you give us an idea? Do you have a list of schools that, based on not just enrollment, but facility structure, the needs of the students, which schools you'll be looking at?
You know what? I reflect back on the previous process that started. It was called the Equity 2020 process. And, schools were looked at from facilities from, I believe, an achievement perspective as well in the enrollment. But those are not the only lenses. I keep going back to that. That it's not just about that. It's making sure that we think about the programs that exist. And it's not only about closing a school. We can say, right, well, for example, the Martin Luther King building, it is no longer going to be a pre-K 8 building. That's going to be a middle school building. And so we're not closing the school, but we are restructuring the program there.
You mentioned that there's a lot of emphasis on process and getting community input. The last time you were on the show, you were on with Office of Child Advocate Sarah Egan. We were talking about a really disturbing report from her office with the way the Hartford School District had handled abuse allegations by their staff against students. At the time, this is what you told us.
I will tell you that moving forward, it stops with everyone, right, at all levels of the organization, and making sure that everyone is held accountable.
So I'm curious, since that time, how have you put that process in place? Do parents and students feel safe in your schools?
If I look at it from a technical perspective, which is where we had to enter the work, right, making sure that all of our staff was trained, making sure that we communicated with our community as to the report and our action plan moving forward, and then making sure that our students understand that there are staff members that are going to be responsive to their needs. And so we're now going to monitor, right? We're going to monitor our behavior, our culture and climate data, because those are indicators, right, that can tell us whether or not our students feel safe. We are, like I talked about before when I believe Mary was the caller, we talked about the whole student framework and making sure that we approach how we interact with our students in the classroom, outside the classrooms, from a perspective that values the integrity of who they are as a person. But from an organizational perspective, Lucy, when I think about the priorities, now we have 4 core priorities. Yes, high-quality teaching and learning, and yes, learning-focused partnerships. Those are 2 priorities that carried on from the previous strategic operating plan. But we have 2 new priorities. One is operational effectiveness, and the other is systemic accountability. And so when I think about and reflect about that report, yes, as grave as it was around the safety piece, it spoke as to the entire infrastructure of our organization. When you have something like that, you have to step back as a leader and look at all of the other systems and processes that are at play or not functioning. And so it's something that we're going to do at all levels of the organization, holding ourselves accountable to the work in relation to child safety, in relation to teaching and learning, in relation to the partnerships that we have.
What's your relationship with the labor unions that represent the staff, the teachers, and how does that play into when you have these kinds of allegations? Again, that report found that some of these staff members were still able to keep their jobs.
So I wanted to make sure that I was very, transparent as to the expectations, and then collaborative in moving forward. And so I believe that I have a good relationship with all of our union leadership. And, they're part of building the capacity as well. We're not we're in it together, if you will. If there are allegations, we do our due diligence and we investigate everything. And so I want to say there's an understanding that we are not going to tolerate children being hurt. That's just no longer the way we operate. And so that message has been well received. And I believe that we are all supporting each other in that effort. With regard to teachers that were able to keep their jobs, I wanted to go back to the fact that we have looked at all of those cases and we confirmed that there were no teachers that were substantiated that were still in our system.
And we'll have to leave it there. The hour went quickly, but I want to thank Hartford School Superintendent Dr. Leslie Torres-Rodriguez. We hope you can come back with us maybe in December when you are dealing with this consolidation, when you know more about the schools that will be closing, and we can get some parent perspective in on that conversation as well.
I would love to come back. Thank you.
I want to thank producer Lydia Brown, WNPR executive producer Katie Tolarski, and our technical producer, Kyone Wolf. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Have a great weekend.